Hello and welcome to video lecture in political science. Today we are going to discuss chapter 1 titled as Cold War from your 12th class textbook Contemporary World Politics. For understanding, we have divided this chapter into 6 parts. So far in the previous 5 parts we have discussed about the end of Second World War, Cuban Missile Crisis, Cold War and the logic of deterrence. We have discussed about the division of world into Eastern and Western Bloc or East Alliance and West Alliance on the basis of the ideological divide between communism and capitalism. We have discussed briefly about arms control treaties and the emergence of NAM. Today in this part of the chapter, we will discuss about NIEO, that is New International Economic Order, and India's role as a non-aligned country. Now, as you know that most of the non-aligned countries had gained recently independence from the colonial rule, either the British, French or the Portuguese. After independence, economic development was necessary in order to overcome the plunder and exploitation they had witnessed during the foreign rule, like in the case of India. They realized that along with political independence, sustainable economic development was necessary. Otherwise, these countries will remain dependent upon their richer countries, which were once upon a time the colonial powers which had ruled them. Now, although in the first summit of NAM in 1961, the economic issues were not given too much of importance, but by the middle of 1970s, economic issues became the most important issues for the NAM countries. NAM actually became an economic pressure group. From this change in position came out the idea of New International Economic Order, that is NIEO. NIEO was a comprehensive package of multilateral policy options that aimed to improve the position of third world countries in the world economy. What is multilateral? Multilateral is where large number of countries are in relation with one another and they carry out certain policies for their own benefit. Multilateralism can be seen in the foreign policy of many nations. In contrast to bilateralism, where only two countries are interacting with one another. Now, it came out at the NAM conference held in September 1973 that multilateral policies must be adopted by these countries in order to progress and ensure economic development. Subsequently, the leaders of NAM requested a special session of the UN General Assembly through the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. This was to revise the international economic system in the favor of third world countries, and they wanted them to address the issues associated with international trade, raw material, promote the interest of the third world countries by improving the terms of trade, increase development assistance, that is the aid which is given to these nations for the development, and reduction of tariff. The objective of NIEO was to enhance capacity building and develop collective self-reliance among the members of NAM in order to attain sustainable, people-centric economic and social goals for development. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development proposed reforms in the global trading systems. These reforms were proposed in order to give the LDCs certain benefits. What were these benefits? The first one is control over natural resources which have been so far exploited by the developed countries when they were colonizing the countries. The second important point was to reduce the cost of import of technology from the Western countries. As you know, there was a gap in the technological advancement of the Western countries and the developing countries. And the technology which was imported from the developed world or the Western countries came at a high price. So, they wanted reduction in the cost of import of this technology, which can be further used for the benefit of the developing countries. The third point is that they wanted to provide LDCs or least developed countries greater role in international economic institutions, which is IMF, International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, and provide them access to the Western markets for selling their products and enhance trade. All these benefits would have benefited the economies of the developing world. The LDCs or least developed countries called for debt relief, and they also wanted a powerful voice of the third world on the boards of IMF, that is International Monetary Fund, and World Bank, so that their ideas and their needs can also get represented in these bodies. However, during the late 1980s, NIEO initiative lost its strength because all these countries that composed NIEO were quite diverse, with each having its own individual interest. They struggled to maintain unity in front of the stiff opposition of the developed countries, who were united for carrying out their own interest. There were many divisions within NAM that blocked their progress, and the NIEO failed because of lack of strong voice and strength of unity among its founding members. In brief, the NAM countries did not succeed in their effort because the LDCs and countries from the third world did not have enough resources to carry out the reforms also that they intended to initiate. They lacked economic and military apparatus also to carry out the resolutions that were designed in the initial years after independence. Rather, on the contrary, interestingly, many member states, despite saying that they are not aligned with any of the power blocks, that is, they are part of NAM, non-aligned countries, they were aligned with one or the other superpower. As we can say in the case of Cuba, which was aligned with USSR, usually most of them were aligned with the Eastern Bloc. As we have also discussed that most of the founding members, those 5 we discussed, they all espoused the cause of socialism. So they were somehow tilted towards the Eastern Bloc. Now let us briefly discuss India's policy and position during the Cold War years. As India was one of the founding members of NAM, it played an active role during the Cold War era. On one hand, India stayed away from the two power blocks and maintained equal distance from both the sides. On the other hand, India also raised its voice against any newly independent country to become part of the two power blocks. If any country got inclined towards any of the power bloc, India raised its voice and wanted it to remain non-aligned. India's policy to remain non-aligned cannot be seen as either negative or passive. As Nehru had said, it is not a policy of fleeing away, that is, escaping from the scene. But on the contrary, India was playing an active role in interfering or intervening in the world affairs, and it attempted to reduce Cold War rivalries also. Diplomats and leaders from India communicated and mediated between the superpowers to prevent differences. For example, they did so during the war in Korea during 1950s. India also mobilized other non-aligned countries to further the cause of peace and stability. That was the goal of NAM countries. It also engaged regional and international organizations for its purpose, both for peace, stability and economic development of the least developed countries. Nehru expressed great faith in Commonwealth of free and cooperating nations that would lead to advancement of the newly independent nations. He was one of the leaders with the notion that this Commonwealth can play an important role in reducing Cold War rivalries, if not ending it. In the whole process, India got benefited in two important ways. What are these two important ways? First is that by not aligning with any of the superpower, India could assume a strong position and take international decisions that served India's interest rather than the interest of the superpower. So it ultimately emerged out in a strong position. And the second benefit was that India also had the ability to balance one superpowers against one another, very tactfully sometimes. If in case India felt ignored or pressurized by one superpower, India could tilt or lean towards the other. And in the process, India played a very diplomatic role, in which neither of the power blocks could take India for granted or dominate it or pressurize it unnecessarily. But then in the entire process, by playing diplomatically or tactfully, India faced certain criticisms also. These criticisms are regarding the policy of non-alignment adopted by India. It is often said that in the name of pursuing its national interest, India often did not take any strong position on number of significant international issues. For example, during the War of Afghanistan, it neither supported it nor condemned it. In fact, India should have taken at least a principled stand or a moral ground. Now, the second criticism to India's approach comes from the point that India often took contradictory positions, that is, opposing positions, and was quite inconsistent on its policy stance. It adopted a conflicting position by claiming that it will not join any of the alliance. But India was severely criticized for signing a treaty of friendship with USSR for 20 years in 1971. That was the era when Cold War reached its peak. Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation, as it is called, specified mutual strategic cooperation between the two nations. Although India criticized and mobilized others not to join any of the alliance, Eastern or Western alliance, but it itself signed the treaty with USSR. This treaty was a deviation from the position India had earlier adopted as non-aligned country, and it was seen as virtually joining the Soviet camp or Soviet alliance. Although India defends its position by saying that India required diplomatic and military support during the Bangladesh crisis, and it also says that this treaty with USSR did not stop India from having good relations with any other country, even with the US for that matter. But despite these justifications, India was criticized for its position it held during the entire Cold War crisis. Now, despite criticisms, NAM has certain important significant values and significant ideas to contribute. What are these important ideas? It recognized that the newly independent and lesser developed countries share common past of exploitation and domination by the colonizers. They can become powerful and developed if they come together and help each other in the process of achieving sustainable development. NAM also held the view that smaller countries should and need not become dependent upon the big countries. They must have their independent foreign policies. NAM was based on the ideas to democratize the international system, challenge the bipolarity, and establish alternative world order to address the issues of political and economic inequality at the global level. NAM remained at the core of India's foreign policy till the disintegration of the USSR in 1991, after which the Cold War era has been labelled as ending. It is also relevant for you to know that India's foreign policy is guided by 5 important principles. These 5 pillars are established as Panchsheel or 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. What are these principles? Let us list them quickly. These are: first, respect for territorial integrity. Second, mutual non-aggression. The third important principle is mutual non-interference in the domestic affairs of the other countries. Fourth principle is equality and mutual benefit. And finally, fifth pillar is peaceful coexistence. NAM as a strategy evolved during the Cold War, and hence it is assumed that with the end of Cold War, it has lost its relevance and significance. But we will see in the future that some of the core ideas and values of the NAM, the movement, are relevant even today. The other topics or chapters in this book are related to this event only, the Cold War. You can see this or understand this chapter as background to understand the nature and matrix of contemporary world politics. The Cold War ended with fall of Eastern Bloc. It is known by many names such as fall of communism, fall of Iron Curtain, fall of Berlin Wall, triumph of capitalism, etc. You will learn more about these in the subsequent chapters. Coming towards the end of this chapter, before we conclude this chapter, let us understand the event of Cold War from the questions or dimensions we had raised in the beginning of the chapter. You remember that we discussed that it is important to analyze and remember any event in world politics from the perspective of what, when, how, where, why, who, and etc. such dimensions. Now, you can try to understand Cold War from these perspectives. What was Cold War? When did it happen? Who were the people involved? Why did it happen? Who were the people who got influenced by it? You can do the same with the Cuban Missile Crisis, or you can do the same with Iron Curtain. So try making a list of these events in the world history, in world politics, and try to analyze, fill these boxes by writing what happened, when did it happen, why did it happen, who were involved, and how did it affect people. So to conclude, let's summarize this chapter, what we discussed in 6 different episodes. We discussed the end of World War and the beginning of Cold War as the background of this chapter. Then we discussed about the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was one of the examples of the height of the Cold War era. We discussed about the division of the world into 2 rival blocs. These rival blocs were headed by the US and the USSR, both of them advocating the communist and the capitalist form of social and economic organization. This rivalry was rooted in the ideological divide. This ideological divide led to the formation of Berlin Wall and Iron Curtain, the division of Europe into Eastern and Western Bloc. We also discussed about the fear of destruction in the minds of the US and the USSR and the logic of deterrence that prevented Cold War from getting turned into hot war. We also discussed about certain arms ban treaties and agreements signed between these two, like LTBT, START 1, START 2, SALT 1, SALT 2 and NPT. In the last part of these episodes, we discussed about NAM, Non-Aligned Movement, and how smaller states formed new international economic order. We also discussed about problems with NAM and how it lost its significance and effectiveness on the global political scene. And towards the end, we discussed about India's position during the Cold War eras. This is not the end, but the beginning of world politics. Enjoy reading this book. Thank you.